Chapter 1. A Child of the Virginia Frontier. Tonight, our story begins not in a grand hall or battlefield, but beside the still waters of Pope's Creek, in a place where the riverbanks breathe with reeds and the trees rise gently from soft, loamy soil. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia. His childhood was not one of royal luxuries or gleaming palaces, but of modest plantation life in the American colonies. His father, Augustine Washington, was a planter and justice of the peace. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, a strong-willed woman, would come to shape young George's sense of duty, patience, and moral clarity. As a child, George wandered through orchards and forests, barefoot in the summer sun. The world around him was immense and humming with life. Turtles in the creek, deer in the brush, and birds in the high branches. He was the eldest of 6 children from his mother's marriage and had older half-siblings from his father's first. Together, they roamed the lands, worked the fields, and prayed at night under candlelight. His early education was informal but disciplined. He was tutored at home and later attended local schools, where he learned reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. He studied books on farming, land surveying, and manners, a colonial code of conduct that emphasized honor, integrity, and civility. When George was just 11, his father died, and much of his inheritance went to his older half-brothers. This might have left some bitter, but for George it became a formative test of character. Without the privilege of attending school in England like his brothers, he began charting his own course. He apprenticed as a land surveyor in his teens, a profession that took him deep into Virginia's forests and hills. Day after day he measured, mapped, and walked untamed land. With only a compass, a quill, and his sharp mind, he transformed the wilderness into order on paper. This work taught him endurance and solitude, and it gave him his first taste of independence. At night, he would sleep beneath the stars, the earth his mattress and the sky his ceiling. Those lonely evenings on the frontier carved into him a quiet strength. They also stirred within him a reverence for the American land, its vastness, its silence, and its promise. Even as a young man, Washington was known for his height and composure. He stood taller than most, with broad shoulders and a calm gaze. People noticed his bearing, the way he carried himself not with arrogance, but with a quiet sense of purpose. These traits made him a natural leader even before he held any formal title. He read books about military tactics, the art of leadership, and the philosophy of honor. And always he wrote letters, journal entries, notes on his travels. These writings, many still preserved today, reveal a young man both curious and determined, striving not for glory, but for the respect of his peers and the improvement of himself. In those formative years, before the Revolution, before the presidency, before the nation itself, George Washington was just a boy of the frontier, a boy who loved the land, valued duty, and dreamed quietly of something greater. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine that Virginia countryside, the sound of frogs near the creek, the rustle of wind in the tall grass, and a young boy walking barefoot under the stars, not knowing that one day he would help found a new nation. Sleep well, dream gently, and we'll continue our story in the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Making of a Young Officer. As the warm breezes of Virginia stirred the tobacco leaves and the colonies thrived under British rule, a young George Washington found himself drawn into a world of maps, muskets, and military matters. He had returned from his surveying expeditions older in spirit, hardened by the wild, and eager for a larger purpose. At just 20 years old, Washington was appointed a district adjutant in the Virginia militia. He now held the rank of major, tasked with training colonial troops and relaying information to the British military command. It was a position of prestige but also great responsibility. The British Empire and the French were at odds over control of North America. Their contest over the Ohio River Valley, a vast, fertile frontier, was heating into open conflict. Native nations, long the stewards of this land, found themselves pulled between two European empires vying for dominance. In 1753, Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia selected George for a dangerous diplomatic mission, to deliver a message to the French, demanding that they vacate their forts in the Ohio Valley. Though young and untested in diplomacy, Washington was chosen for his discipline and resolve. He set out in late fall, trudging through snow-choked forests with a small party of frontiersmen, guides, and a translator. His route cut through icy rivers and hostile territory. He nearly drowned in the freezing Allegheny River and once found himself directly in the line of fire when a native guide turned on him. But he survived. His mission failed, the French refused to leave, but Washington's journal, published upon his return, made him a minor celebrity throughout the colonies. His writing was measured, clear, and full of quiet bravery. A star was beginning to rise. By 1754, tensions erupted into open warfare, and Washington led a small force to confront the French at Fort Duquesne. The confrontation turned bloody. In the dense woods of present-day Pennsylvania, he oversaw a surprise attack that killed a French envoy, an incident that triggered the French and Indian War. His first real taste of battle came at Fort Necessity, where his makeshift defenses fell under heavy attack. After a long day of fighting in the rain and mud, Washington was forced to surrender. It was the only time he ever would. Though humbling, the defeat taught him critical lessons in strategy, logistics, and the limits of youthful ambition. He returned to Virginia a changed man. Instead of sulking in disgrace, he redoubled his studies. He read books on siege warfare, logistics, and European military theory. And when General Edward Braddock arrived from England to take command, Washington volunteered as an aide-de-camp. In 1755, Braddock's army marched toward Fort Duquesne again, this time with a far larger and more disciplined force. Washington rode beside the general, offering advice about the terrain and colonial warfare. But Braddock, steeped in European tradition, ignored Washington's warnings. The result was disastrous. Outside the fort, the British were ambushed by French troops and their native allies. The forest exploded with musket fire, smoke, and chaos. Red-coated soldiers fell by the dozens. Braddock was mortally wounded. In the middle of the carnage, Washington rose to the moment. Though bullets tore through his coat and horses were shot out from under him, he never flinched. He organized a retreat, rallied panicked men, and carried Braddock's body from the field. His composure during the battle became legendary. Colonists began to speak of him as a man protected by Providence. After Braddock's death, Washington returned home to Virginia, where he was appointed commander of all provincial troops in the colony. He was just 23. In this role, he oversaw the defense of the frontier during the remainder of the war. Though often frustrated by a lack of supplies, poor training, and British arrogance toward colonial officers, Washington did not abandon his post. He built forts, trained militia, and wrote letters pleading for better support. It was grueling work. During this time, he also courted and married a wealthy widow, Martha Custis. With her came not only affection, but also land, social status, and 2 children from her previous marriage. Their union, while not fiery with romance, was built on mutual respect and stability. With the war ending in 1763 and the French expelled from much of North America, Washington resigned his commission. He was tired. He returned to Mount Vernon, a plantation he had gradually inherited and expanded, and turned his focus to farming, family, and quiet reflection. He was no longer the young boy surveying the frontier, nor the untested officer of Fort Necessity. He was a seasoned man of war, scarred but sharpened by his experiences. But peace, like seasons, never lasts forever. And across the Atlantic, in the marble halls of Parliament and the gilded rooms of King George III, changes were beginning that would soon pull George Washington back into the tide of history. Chapter 3: The Road to Revolution. When George Washington returned to Mount Vernon after the war, he hoped for peace and prosperity. The land, the river, and the soft hills of Virginia were his solace. He became a gentleman farmer, overseeing hundreds of acres, studying crop rotation, and experimenting with fertilizers and livestock. Though he owned enslaved people and benefited from the system, he also began, slowly and silently, to question the morality of that institution, a conflict that would follow him for the rest of his life. But the peace he had fought for did not last. The British Crown, burdened with debt from the war, looked to the colonies for revenue. Taxes were passed, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all without colonial representation in Parliament. To many, it was not the money but the principle. The colonies were being treated as subjects, not citizens. Washington, like many Virginians, was deeply loyal to the Crown. But loyalty was not blind. In letters to friends, he expressed unease at the growing overreach of British authority. "The crisis is arrived when we must assert our rights," he would later write. He joined others in signing non-importation agreements, boycotting British goods. He studied the writings of Locke and Montesquieu and read newspapers from Boston to Charleston. The colonies were not just aggrieved, they were awakening. In 1774, the British closed Boston's port as punishment for the Boston Tea Party. Washington called it an invasion of our rights. That same year, he was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He traveled north, joining men like John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams. They debated, they argued, but above all, they planned. The following spring, gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord. American blood had been shed. The revolution had begun. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775. The delegates knew they needed someone to lead their ragtag army of farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers. They needed someone from the South to unite the regions. Someone dignified, experienced, and steady. They chose George Washington. He accepted with humility. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he said. But from that moment on, he would wear his uniform until independence was won. He left for Boston, where militia forces were encircling the city. He found men brave but disorganized, lacking supplies, discipline, and leadership. Washington immediately set about turning the siege into a proper army. He enforced discipline, issued drills, and demanded accountability. He treated his men with fairness, but also with firmness. Even in wartime, order must be kept. He set up his headquarters in a modest house in Cambridge, writing letters by candlelight, inspecting trenches by day, and planning each movement with care. For 9 months, he maintained the siege, waiting for the right moment. In March 1776, under cover of night, Washington moved cannons to Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston. When the British awoke, they saw the guns pointed at their ships. They evacuated the city within days. It was Washington's first major victory, and it electrified the colonies. But there was no time to rest. The British soon set their sights on New York City. In the summer of 1776, Washington moved his forces south to prepare. That same summer, on July 4th, Congress declared independence. Washington had the Declaration of Independence read aloud to his troops. He wanted them to know what they were fighting for, not just land, not just liberty, but a new nation, born in the belief that all men are created equal. The war that followed would test Washington more than any man alive. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and constantly outmaneuvered. In the battles around New York, he suffered defeat after defeat. His men retreated across New Jersey, ragged and starving. Some historians believe the revolution nearly collapsed in that winter of 1776. But Washington never wavered. He understood that leadership is not always about victory, but about presence. His men saw him ride through snow and storm, sharing their hardships, asking for no privilege above theirs. On Christmas night, 1776, with the Delaware River freezing behind them, Washington led his men in a surprise attack on Trenton. They crossed ice-choked waters in the dark, marched in silence, and struck before dawn. The victory was small in scale, but enormous in spirit. It proved to the world and to themselves that the Americans could fight and win. Washington followed with another victory at Princeton, then pulled back to regroup. Over the next years, he would lose and win, retreat and strike again. He managed alliances with France, navigated tensions with Congress, and kept the idea of America alive in the minds of his people. He was not flawless, his temper could flare, and at times he made strategic errors. But what set him apart was not perfection, it was perseverance. As the war dragged on, Washington's name became sacred among his troops. They called him His Excellency, not out of ceremony, but out of deep respect. He rode with them, starved with them, bled with them. Through it all, he never took a salary. He asked only for his expenses to be covered. As 1781 approached, the tide was turning. With the help of French troops and Admiral de Grasse's fleet, Washington cornered British General Cornwallis at Yorktown. After weeks of siege, the British surrendered. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. As bells rang and fireworks burst, Washington did not rush to claim power or parade through cities. He simply thanked his soldiers, wrote to Congress, and rode home. To Mount Vernon. To peace. To the silence he had always cherished. But peace, as always, is never simple. And history, like a slow-turning wheel, was not yet done with George Washington. Chapter 4. The Reluctant President. When the dust of war finally settled and the British departed, George Washington could have seized power. He had the loyalty of the army, the adoration of the people, and the credibility of victory. In most revolutions throughout history, such power is rarely surrendered. But Washington did something almost unheard of. He walked away. In December 1783, in the Maryland State House at Annapolis, he resigned his military commission before Congress. The hall was silent as he spoke, his voice steady. "Having now finished the work assigned me," he said, "I retire from the great theater of action." With that, he returned to Mount Vernon once more. For the first time in years, he was not a general, not a politician, just a farmer again. He tended to his fields, rotated his crops, and oversaw his estate. He exchanged letters with former officers, met visitors from Europe, and watched as a new country struggled to find its footing. The Articles of Confederation, the nation's first attempt at government, were proving weak. There was no central authority to regulate trade, no power to raise taxes, no unified military. States argued like siblings, and the Union felt fragile. Washington observed quietly but with concern. He believed in republicanism, but also in order and unity. He feared that the revolution's ideals might be lost in chaos. In 1787, he was asked to attend a convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. He hesitated. He had left public life. He was aging. He craved peace. But duty, as always, pulled at him. He arrived in Philadelphia in May, where delegates from every state except Rhode Island had gathered. Tall, broad-shouldered, and still commanding despite his years, Washington was unanimously elected president of the Constitutional Convention. He spoke little during the debates, preferring to guide by presence rather than persuasion. But his mere attendance lent gravity to the work. The framers knew, if they could craft a constitution worthy of Washington's approval, it might just succeed. That summer, through heat and discord, the Constitution took shape. A balance of powers, a system of checks, a federal union. When it was finished, the delegates signed it, Washington's name appearing first. The document then went to the states for ratification. It sparked fierce debate, but eventually, one by one, the states agreed. A new nation was born, not a loose confederation of colonies, but a republic. Now came the question, who would lead it? The answer was clear to all. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. It remains the only unanimous election in American history. With solemnity and humility, he made the journey from Virginia to New York City, the temporary capital. Crowds lined the roads. Bells rang in towns. People wept at the sight of him. On April 30th, 1789, Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall and took the oath of office. His hand rested on a Bible. A hush fell over the gathered crowd. "I solemnly swear," he began, "that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." He then bowed to the people. The presidency, now one of the most powerful offices in the world, began not with a roar but with quiet dignity. Washington's first term was not glamorous. It was filled with uncertainty. There were no models, no predecessors. Every action he took would set a precedent. He formed a cabinet, choosing Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. They were brilliant men, though often in fierce disagreement. Jefferson feared centralized power. Hamilton favored a strong federal government. Washington, ever the unifier, listened carefully and tried to balance competing visions. He established the first national bank, supported the Bill of Rights, and helped suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, a test of federal authority. He emphasized neutrality in foreign affairs, wary of European entanglements. Though he never sought personal power, people began to refer to him as Mr. President, a modest title he helped normalize over grander options like Your Excellency or His Highness. The press, once respectful, grew more critical. Political factions emerged. Jeffersonian Republicans and Hamiltonian Federalists began to clash more openly. Washington, distressed by the rise of partisanship, often longed to return to Mount Vernon. But he accepted a second term in 1792, again unanimously elected. In his second term, he faced new challenges. War erupted in Europe, and pressures mounted for the U.S. to take sides. Washington held firm. America was too young, too fragile. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, a decision that drew praise and condemnation alike. But it bought the new nation time to grow. In 1796, after 8 years of leadership, he declined a third term. His farewell address, printed and distributed across the country, became one of the foundational documents of American political thought. In it, he warned against excessive partisanship, foreign entanglements, and the dangers of despotism. He urged unity. He urged virtue. And once more, he returned to Mount Vernon. No parades, no monuments, no golden crowns. Just home, just peace, just quiet. But even in retirement, he remained a symbol of strength, of dignity, of Republican ideals made real. He had guided a fragile union through war and uncertainty. He had resisted the temptations of kingship. And in doing so, he gave the nation something far greater than power. He gave it precedent. He gave it trust. He gave it time. But history was not finished writing its final chapter on George Washington. Not yet. Chapter 5, The Final Years and Eternal Legacy. Back at Mount Vernon, George Washington found solace in the rhythms of rural life. He rose early, walked the grounds, managed his crops, greeted guests, read newspapers and correspondence by candlelight. It was a life of quiet dignity, a return to the soil from which he had risen. But even in retirement, he could not completely escape public service. In 1798, with tensions escalating between the United States and France in what became known as the Quasi-War, President John Adams asked Washington to serve once more, as commander-in-chief of a provisional army, should war erupt. Washington agreed, but on one condition: He would not take the field unless absolutely necessary. Still, his name alone served as a powerful deterrent. His countrymen knew he would answer the call if needed. France, too, took notice. That crisis passed peacefully, and Washington, by now in his late 60s, continued to focus on Mount Vernon. But age was catching him. In December 1799, after riding horseback in snow and sleet to inspect his lands, Washington returned home chilled and hoarse. The next day he complained of a sore throat. By nightfall he could barely speak. Doctors arrived and attempted to treat him using the standard medical practices of the time, including bloodletting. They took over a third of his blood in less than 12 hours. It did not help. On the night of December 14, 1799, surrounded by his wife Martha and close aides, George Washington whispered his final instructions and quietly passed away. He was 67 years old. The nation was stunned. Word spread slowly by courier, horseback, and newspaper, but as it traveled, grief swept through the land. Bells tolled in Boston. Shops closed in Philadelphia. Congress dressed in black for a month of mourning. In England, the House of Commons paused to honor him. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered 10 days of national mourning. There had never been anyone quite like him. He had led the colonies through rebellion, helped birth a republic, refused a crown, and walked away from ultimate power, not once but twice. And in doing so, he became a symbol of something greater than ambition. He became a symbol of integrity. The man behind the marble. Much has been made of Washington's grandeur. His statuesque posture, his deep voice, his piercing gaze. But behind the portraits and monuments stood a man of paradoxes. He was formal yet reserved, commanding yet humble. His temper, when provoked, was fierce, but he learned to master it. He owned slaves, yet spoke of liberty. And though he did not publicly lead the abolitionist cause, in his will, he took an extraordinary step. He freed the enslaved people he personally owned, making him the only founding father to do so outright. He knew the nation was imperfect, just as he was, but he believed in its promise. In his personal writings, he often reflected on mortality, on the fleeting nature of power, on the responsibility of citizenship. He feared the erosion of virtue, the rise of faction, and the seduction of tyranny. And yet he remained hopeful. Because for George Washington, hope was not naive, it was necessary. The echo of legacy. In the centuries since his passing, Washington's name has become sacred to American memory. His likeness adorns currency, stamps, schools, and cities. The Capitol bears his name. His image watches from the monumental peak of Mount Rushmore. He is remembered as the father of his country, though he himself would have likely shunned such grand titles. But his true legacy cannot be carved in stone or folded into dollar bills. It lives in ideas. The idea that power should be tempered by principle. That a leader must answer not to ego, but to duty. That freedom must be earned and preserved. He was not perfect. No human is. But in the furnace of revolution and the slow forging of a republic, Washington's character became a mold. One that generations have looked to, wrestled with, and often aspired to emulate. He once wrote, "I walk on untrodden ground. There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." He knew that his every step would echo through time. The eternal watch. At Mount Vernon, overlooking the Potomac River, Washington lies buried beneath a marble sarcophagus. Visitors still come quietly, reverently. Some bow their heads. Others touch the iron gate. Children peer through with curiosity. Veterans salute. The estate is calm. The trees sway gently. The river glides past, as it did in his youth. And in the hush of that place you can still feel him. Not the general astride a horse. Not the president behind a desk. But the man who loved his country more than his own power. Who gave up command so that democracy might stand. Who shaped a nation not by conquest but by character. Candle, and so tonight, as we close the pages of history and settle into slumber, we remember George Washington, not just as a figure in marble or myth, but as a man who gave everything he could to an idea called America. He did not live to see its fullest form, but because of him it had a chance to grow. And as the stars hang above the quiet Potomac, the first light of liberty flickers still. Sleep now in the company of legends. Tomorrow waits. Chapter 6. Washington's Personal World, Life at Mount Vernon. As the sun sets beyond the hills of Virginia, and the Potomac River reflects the dusky light like a mirror of the sky, we return to a quieter time, to a place of whitewashed walls and rolling fields, of oak trees and orchard blossoms, of soft footsteps on gravel paths and the rustle of linen curtains in the breeze. This was Mount Vernon. More than just a plantation, Mount Vernon was George Washington's home, his sanctuary from the thunder of war and the noise of politics. It was the place where he breathed most freely, where his heart was most at peace. He inherited the estate from his half-brother Lawrence, who had named it after a British admiral, Edward Vernon. When George came into ownership in the late 1750s, it was a modest 1.5-story farmhouse overlooking the river. But over the years he transformed it. With a vision as steady as the hands of a master builder, he expanded the home into a grand, symmetrical mansion. He added wings and a piazza, an open-air, columned veranda facing the Potomac. From that porch, one could look out across the river to the misty blue ridges of Maryland. The view never failed to stir something deep within him. But Mount Vernon was more than architecture. It was a working plantation, over 8,000 acres of farmland, pastures, forests, and fisheries. Washington oversaw every detail. He rose before dawn, often by candlelight, to review accounts, weather reports, and daily schedules. His mind was always working. He kept detailed journals and letters, noting everything from crop rotations and soil health to experimental breeding of livestock. He was particularly fascinated by innovation in agriculture, adopting a 7-year rotation system and building a state-of-the-art threshing barn that used horses to separate wheat from chaff. Washington once wrote, "I had rather be on my farm than be emperor of the world." And he meant it. Yet, for all its peaceful rhythms, Mount Vernon was also a place of complexity and contradiction. It was home to hundreds of enslaved people, men, women, and children, whose labor powered the estate's operations. They plowed fields, cooked meals, sewed garments, forged iron, and served in the house. Washington knew them by name. He recorded their work, their illnesses, and even allowed some to earn wages when hired out. And though he did not speak publicly against slavery during his life, in private, his views evolved. In his final will, he took a step that was radical for his time. He ordered that all the enslaved people he personally owned be freed after his wife's death. He also made provisions for the education and care of the elderly and young among them. It did not erase the pain of bondage, but it marked the first presidential recognition that such a system was morally untenable, and it set a quiet example for the nation. A life with Martha. Mount Vernon was also where George Washington lived much of his married life with Martha Custis Washington. She was a widow when they met, with 2 surviving children and considerable wealth. Their marriage in 1759 joined 2 powerful Virginia families and brought stability to George's personal life. Martha was warm, gracious, and deeply pious. She managed the household with care, overseeing meals, clothing, and the upbringing of her children and grandchildren. Their bond was rooted not in fiery passion, but in mutual respect, shared purpose, and quiet affection. During the war, Martha often traveled to camp to be by his side, knitting, tending to wounded soldiers, hosting dignitaries in simple quarters. She provided him with emotional shelter amid the storm of revolution. At Mount Vernon, they entertained guests with dignity but modesty. The dinner table was rich but not extravagant. The conversation was genteel, thoughtful, and often philosophical. The couple enjoyed music. Martha played the spinet, and George, though not a musician, loved the sound of soft chamber music at twilight. Routine and reflection. Washington's days at Mount Vernon followed a steady rhythm. He would walk the estate grounds, often with his hound dogs beside him. Names like Sweet Lips, True Love, and Vulcan. He enjoyed horseback rides through wooded trails and along the riverbanks. He examined fencing, checked millstones, and consulted with overseers. Evenings were for reading, letter writing, and occasionally cards or chess. His library contained volumes on history, agriculture, philosophy, and political science. And when the weather was fine, he would stand on the piazza, arms folded behind his back, gazing out at the Potomac as if it whispered memories from every chapter of his life. There were moments of melancholy, too. He often reflected on his legacy, on the fragility of the Republic, and on whether he had done enough. The people of the estate. Though he was a towering figure in American life, Washington knew the names and stories of many who lived and worked at Mount Vernon. There was William Lee, his trusted valet and body servant, who followed him throughout the Revolution. Lee was enslaved but held in deep esteem by Washington, who granted him immediate freedom upon his death and provided a lifelong pension. There were blacksmiths, cooks, seamstresses, field hands, carpenters, and stable masters, each with lives, struggles, and dreams of their own. In many ways, Mount Vernon was a microcosm of the early republic, a place striving to balance freedom and dependence, wealth and morality, tradition and change. The lantern burns low. As the years passed, Washington aged gracefully. He suffered from ailments of the teeth and joints. He wore dentures made not of wood, as legend says, but of ivory, gold, and even human teeth, some from enslaved people, a haunting reminder of the complexities of his world. But still he worked, still he walked, still he wrote. Visitors came from across the globe, French aristocrats, American statesmen, poets, and farmers, hoping to glimpse the great man in his quiet retirement. And to each he offered warmth, conversation, and hospitality. He never raised his voice in self-congratulation, never adorned his home with triumphs. He preferred humility, for he believed that history, not hubris, should decide a man's worth. And so Mount Vernon became not just a home, but a mirror of his values, a place where civility mattered, where labor was respected, where nature and nurture intertwined. Night falls at Mount Vernon. Tonight, as you rest your head and the soft hush of night surrounds you, picture the old mansion standing quiet beneath a canopy of stars. The candlelight flickers behind glass windows. The porch creaks gently in the breeze, and George Washington walks slowly across the lawn, hands clasped behind his back, thinking not of battles or ballots, but of peace. He was a man who could have ruled as king, but chose to live as a farmer. And in that simple choice lies the greatness of his character. Rest now, traveler. Tomorrow we will open the final chapter and explore how this one man became more than mortal. He became the symbol of a republic. Chapter 7, the symbol of a new republic. As a new nation rose like dawn over the rugged peaks of early America, one figure loomed above all others, not as a conqueror, not as a king, but as something far rarer. A leader who relinquished power. A man who could have ruled indefinitely, yet chose instead to walk away. This was George Washington's final, most enduring legacy. The reluctant president. In the spring of 1789, after years of retirement at Mount Vernon, Washington received news that the country, his country, had called him once more to serve. He had been unanimously elected the first president of the United States. And though he longed for the simplicity of his estate, for the quiet of rivers and wheat fields, he knew he could not say no. He viewed the presidency not as an honor, but as a duty. The journey from Mount Vernon to New York City, the nation's temporary capital, was a triumphal procession. Towns turned out in celebration. Children waved banners. Old soldiers saluted from the roadside. Church bells rang, and choirs sang praises. But Washington felt only the weight of expectation. He entered the office in a tailored suit of American-made cloth, deliberately avoiding British silk, a quiet nod to the values of the Republic. His inauguration on April 30th, 1789, was solemn. On the balcony of Federal Hall, overlooking Wall Street, he placed his hand on a borrowed Bible and took the oath of office. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from humility. Afterward, he bowed to the crowd rather than waving, a small but symbolic gesture. He was not a ruler, he was a servant, shaping the office. There were no precedents, no playbook, no royal court to guide him. Every decision Washington made helped define what the presidency would become. He created a cabinet to advise him, appointing Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and others who would shape the nation's early years. He insisted on dignity in the office, but not opulence. He refused to be called Your Excellency or Your Highness, opting simply for Mr. President. He toured the young states, listening to farmers, merchants, and veterans. He wanted to be visible, to make the federal government feel real and responsive. But the challenges were immense. The economy was fragile. Factions formed quickly. The balance between federal and state powers was uncertain. Foreign powers watched eagerly, hoping for American failure. Still, Washington stood firm. He helped create the first national bank. He quelled rebellions not with cruelty, but with calm authority. And he navigated a course of neutrality as war raged in Europe, refusing to let the young republic be drawn into foreign entanglements. The second term and the weight of power. Though he longed to return home after one term, the political divisions of the 1790s compelled him to stay. He was re-elected unanimously in 1792, but the second term was harder. The rise of political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, saddened him. He had hoped that unity would define the republic. Instead, personal rivalries and philosophical battles consumed his closest advisors. Jefferson and Hamilton, once colleagues, now clashed bitterly. Newspapers turned venomous. Even Washington himself was not spared from criticism, mocked as a monarch in disguise by those who had once hailed him as a savior. He found it exhausting, and yet, through it all, he preserved the office, kept the nation united, and never once allowed power to corrupt his judgment. Farewell, not forever. In 1796, Washington made a decision that stunned the world. He would not seek a third term. Kings reigned until death. Emperors passed power by blood. But George Washington, beloved and capable, stepped down voluntarily. His farewell address, published, not spoken, was a profound meditation on unity, liberty, and the fragility of the republic. He warned against political factions, foreign alliances, and excessive partisanship. His words were not commands, but guidance, fatherly and firm. "I am influenced by no party," he wrote, "but by a sense of duty." It was the first peaceful transfer of executive power in modern history, and it became a defining feature of American democracy. Final years and legacy. Washington returned once more to Mount Vernon. There, in the stillness of his gardens and the creak of the old wooden floors, he found solace again. He managed the farm, received visitors, and reflected on a life lived in full measure. But on a cold December night in 1799, he developed a sore throat after riding in the rain. Within 2 days, the illness worsened. His throat swelled. Breathing became labored. Doctors tried bloodletting, poultices, and mixtures of molasses and vinegar. But nothing could reverse the tide. Knowing the end was near, Washington remained composed. "Doctor," he said quietly, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Then, turning to his secretary, he whispered, "I am just going. Have me decently buried. And do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 2 days after I am dead." He passed away on December 14th, 1799, at the age of 67. The news spread like winter wind, cold, sudden, and stilling. Across the nation, bells tolled. Farmers paused their work. Congress donned mourning clothes. Even Napoleon in France held a moment of silence. He was gone, but he had already become more than a man. The eternal symbol. George Washington's life was not flawless. He held enslaved people, wrestled with ambition, and struggled with the imperfections of his age. But what set him apart was not just his military genius or his political leadership. It was his character. He refused power when others would have seized it. He served when called, then departed when the work was done. He believed in the Republic more than in himself. And so, as time passed, his name became synonymous with American ideals: liberty, duty, humility, and honor. His image adorned currency, monuments, and capitals. His words were carved into marble, etched into memory, and passed down from generation to generation. He became the quiet heartbeat of a young nation, the figure that reminded Americans not just of where they had come from, but of what they could become. A whisper beneath the stars. And now, as our story draws to a close, let us return once more to Mount Vernon. The fields are quiet. The fireflies blink like distant stars. The house sleeps beneath the weight of history. And in the soft hush of the Virginia night, you can almost hear the echo of footsteps on the gravel path. A tall man in a dark coat, hands clasped, eyes lifted to the horizon, still watching over the republic he helped build, still reminding us that greatness lies not in domination, but in restraint, not in crowns, but in character. Sleep well now. The first president has returned home.